Masechet Shevuot, Daf Tet Vav. Kol shelo na'asit bechol elu v'chule. The Mishnah taught that if someone is tameh and they go to the Hamikdash courtyard area, then they will receive punishment, karet, if done on purpose, if they knew and then forgot and then knew again, korban olev yored, and so on. This includes the original courtyard area proper and also includes any extension that the nation makes to that area. However, that extension has to be made with a certain procedure that includes having the king and the Kohen Gadol with the Urim v'Tumim and the Sanhedrin and Korban Todah and so on. So you have to do this entire procedure in order to make it officially consecrated, the extra part of the courtyard, and therefore be liable. If, however, you don't do this procedure, then it's not officially consecrated, and therefore someone who goes there while tameh will not be punished. We see a machloket now. Itmar, Rav Huna amar bechol elu tenan, Rav Nachman amar be'achat mikol elu tenan. There are two different versions of this Mishnah. Rav Huna reads, bechol elu. You have to do everything on this list. That's going to include having a king and Urim v'Tumim, which we did have in the first Beit Hamikdash time, but we did not have during the second Beit Hamikdash. There was no king for most of it. The Hashmonaim, they called themselves kings, but even then they did not have the Urim v'Tumim, and therefore anything that was extended during the second Beit Hamikdash would not officially be part of the temple courtyard, according to Rav Huna, who says you need everything on the list. Rav Nachman, however, says you should read in the Mishnah, if you do one of these things, then it's consecrated. Even if you don't have everything on the list, but you have some, you could do some of the things on the list. You have the Sanhedrin, or you have the Korban Todah loaves. As long as you have something on the list, you can consecrate it, which means that one can consecrate it in the first Beit HaMikdash for sure, and even in the second Beit HaMikdash, although we were missing some of the items. Rav Huna amar, bechol elu tenan kasabar, kiddusha rishona kiddusha l'sha'ata, ve'kiddusha l'atid labo, ve'ezra zecher be'alma hu de'avad. Now this machloket will have a lot of consequences, because in the time of Ezra, as we saw before from the Pesukim in Nehemiah, there was a consecration ceremony. When they rebuilt the walls of Yerushalayim, there was a whole consecration ceremony. Why did they make a consecration ceremony if they couldn't do so anyway? According to Rav Huna, who needs everything on the list, so really they could not officially make any consecration ceremony in the second Beit HaMikdash. But don't worry, because he thinks that the original consecration of Yerushalayim and of the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash area is a permanent consecration, and so that which was done during the first Beit HaMikdash continues into the second Beit HaMikdash, and so when they built the second Mikdash, they didn't really need to make another consecration. It was already consecrated. Now Ezra, when he made that ceremony, it was just as a commemoration, as a memorial. It didn't have any legal significance, but it was a nice thing to do, and he couldn't do it officially because he didn't have all the items, but it's okay, he didn't need to. It would mean that he couldn't add anything extra. That would also mean that when Herod extended the temple courtyard, the extended area is not actually consecrated. But the original area has permanent consecration, and so Ezra didn't actually have to do anything. Rav Nachman amar be'achat mikol elu tenan, kasabar kiddusha rishona kiddusha l'sha'ata ve'lo kiddusha l'atid labo, va'ezra kiddusha kadish, af agav delahavu urim v'tumim. Rav Nachman says all you need is some of the items on this list in order to perform a proper ceremony. Even if you only have one of the items on the list, it is consecrated. And Rav Nachman, this is consistent with his opinion because he thinks that the original consecration of Yerushalayim and of the courtyard is only temporary, only lasts as long as the Beit HaMikdash is around, but then after that, it's not permanent and does not continue after that. Therefore, Ezra, when they rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash, had to make it consecrated in order for it to be holy. But don't worry, he was able to, even though he didn't have it Urim v'Tumim, since he had some of the other things, he was able to consecrate it. So we see two totally different lines of thought that are self-consistent, but don't agree with each other. Itiber avad Rav Nachman, a challenge against Rav Nachman. Kol shelo na'asit bechol elu. Wait, in our version of the Mishnah it says, if you didn't do all of these things, doesn't that mean you have to do all of them? And the answer is teneh b'achat mikol elu. No, change the wording of the Mishnah. Rav Nachman thinks the wording is not bechol elu, but rather be'achat mikol elu. As long if you didn't do any one of these things, if you did 0 things on the list, then it's not consecrated. But as long as you did one or some of the things on the list, then that's fine. Tashema. Now we're going to bring a proof against Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman, the second opinion here, that says you only have to do one of the items, is going to be challenged from this baraita. Abba Shaul Omer, Shnei Bis'in hayu behar mishcha, tachtona ve'elyona. On Har HaZetim, here's Har HaZetim, there were 2 pools of water, and there was one below and one higher up on the mountain. Tachtona nitkadesha bechol elu. The lower pool and that area around the lower pool was consecrated originally back in the first Beit Hamikdash with everything on the list. So that's official consecration. That's good. That becomes officially part of Yerushalayim. Elyona lo nitkadesha bechol elu, ela be'ole gola, shelo be'melech v'shelo be'urim v'tumim. However, the upper pool was not consecrated with everything in the first Beit HaMikdash, but rather those who returned from exile around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they consecrated, but they did not have a king, and they did not have Urim v'Tumim, and therefore their consecration, this Beraita is assuming, is not official. So you see already here that it's assuming you need everything on the list and not just one thing on the list. So it's already a challenge to Rav Nachman. The Beraita continues, Tachtona she'ayta kedushata gemura הארץ נכנסים לשם ואוכלים שם קודשים קלים, אבל לא מעשר שני. וחברים אוכלים שם קודשים קלים או מעשר שני. The area around the lower pool pond that had full kedusha, it was real kedusha and a permanent kedusha. So in that case, I'll skip to the chaverim. Those who were learned would eat their sanctified food, meaning sacrificial food like a korban shelamim that can be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. This was officially consecrated as part of Yerushalayim, so it's okay to eat it there. And maaser sheni, that you have to bring and eat in Yerushalayim, they would eat there also, and that was perfectly fine. Even though it was not part of the original borders, that's okay. The first Beit HaMikdash, they can extend it wherever they want, and that was included and consecrated. However, the upper pool, which was not officially consecrated, because it was only done in the second temple period, and they did not have Urim v'Tumim. So the upper pool, we're going to get to in a second. The lower pool, the Amei Haaretz, they would go and eat their Kodashim Kalim. That's fine. They would eat there like Korban Shelamim. But they would not eat Maaseh Sheni. Now, this is pretty strange that the Amei Haaretz, who were not learned, were more stringent than the Chaverim. Usually it's the opposite. The Chaverim were very careful with the law, are stringent and everything. Terumah, Maaser, Tahara. And the Amei Haaretz do some things, but are lenient and lax in some things. But here the Amei Haaretz were actually more machmir. However, this happens sometimes that people are machmir actually out of ignorance. The Amei Haaretz didn't quite understand the difference. Really, any place where you can eat Kadashim Kalim, you can also eat Maaser Sheni and vice versa. And any place that you can't, you don't. So the Chaverim knew the law better. And they knew if this is a proper place, it was properly consecrated, then you can eat both. But the Amei Haaretz, because in their ignorance, they thought that Kadashim Kalim you can eat here, but not Maaser Sheni. They wanted to be stringent about Maaser Sheni. It might be because they thought that Maaser Sheni, if you eat it, it brings good luck, but you have to eat it properly. If you eat in the wrong place, so they would not bring good luck and riches for them in the future. So that's why they wanted to be extra careful regarding Maaser Sheni. Whatever they were thinking, okay, it was wrong, but it's okay. They wanted to be stringent upon themselves. Good luck to them. Now, Elyona shelo hayta kedushat gemora. The upper pool, higher up on the mountain, which was only consecrated in the second temple and therefore was not an officially recognized consecration, it was not legally binding, there is really not part of the city of Yerushalayim. And then over there, Amei Haaretz nichnasim sham ve'ochlim sham kodashim kalim aval lo maaser sheni v'chaverim en ochlim sham lo kodashim kalim ve'lo maaser sheni. Let's jump to the chaverim again. The chaverim would not eat there, not sanctified food and not maaser sheni. They are correct because it has no legal legal significance. That it's not consecrated as part of Yerushalayim. The Ma'aretz here, in their ignorance, made a mistake, and they would eat there also. They would eat kadashim, but not maaser sheni. In other words, the Ma'aretz made no distinction between the lower part of the mountain and the upper part of the mountain. On both parts, they would eat kodashim, but they would not eat maaser sheni. So they didn't recognize. They looked at the wall. They saw the official map. It looks like it's part of Yerushalayim. Okay, we'll eat kadashim kalim. Maaser sheni, they wanted to be machmir on everything and only eat it in the original smaller borders of Yerushalayim. So Me'aretz just made a mistake. They're machmir on one hand, to machmir, and they were mekel and ate kodashim outside the official border. So that was a mistake on their part, again, just because they weren't learned. But the chaverim knew the law. Now the question is, why did they not make it sanctified? Because we cannot add to the borders of the city or the temple courtyard unless we have a king and a prophet and a Kohen Gadol with Urim v'Tumim and Sanhedrin of 71 and the two Korban Todas and song. We can have some of these things, but in the second Beit HaMikdash, when they sanctified it, they did not have Urim v'Tumim nor a king. So they could not sanctify it. That explains the law that the Chaverim followed. Now we ask, Velama kideshuha. So then, why did they make it sanctified if they didn't have all these things? We ask a question about that question, a clarification. Lama kideshuha, hamad lo kideshuha. Why are you asking why they made it sanctified? We just said that they did not make it sanctified. It was not officially sanctified. So here's what we meant to ask: Ela lama hichnisuha. Why did they include it in the wall? In other words, they did extend the physical wall. Here's a picture of it, the smaller Jerusalem and the extended Yerushalayim. Why did they include the upper part of the Mount of Olives in the new wall? Because the weak point of Yerushalayim was there, and it would have been easy for the enemies to come in. If they left the wall lower down here, then the enemy would have the area up higher up on the mountain, and that's not good. You never want to have your enemies have the higher ground. We want to have the higher ground, and therefore they included it in the wall so that the enemies would not be able to gain the higher ground, and we could put soldiers there and make sure that they stayed away from the higher ground, keep them away further. So it was important to include in the wall for military defense. So that's why they did it, even though they did not have the legal ability to make it officially consecrated. So that, in any case, we see, according to this Baraita, one could not sanctify during the second Beit HaMikdash because you needed everything on the list. And this is a challenge to Rav Nachman that says you only need one thing on the list. If you only need one thing on the list, then they could have sanctified it, and then they could have eaten their Maaser Sheni and everything even higher up. So this seems to be a serious challenge against Rav Nachman. How can he deal with this Tanaitic source? And the answer is Tanaihi. In fact, there is a Tanaitic machloket. We quoted the Amoraic machloket here, between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, and it's true, the Braita that we quoted just now will support Rav Huna. Okay, Rav Nachman does not have an answer to that, but what Rav Nachman can say is that, yes, although that Braita proves as follows the opinion of Rav Huna, Rav Nachman can say, I follow a different set of Tanaim that agree with me, that say that you don't need you only need one thing on the list, and the holiness of Yerushalayim was temporary, and Ezra Nehemiah, they were able to do a consecration ceremony even with only one of the things on the list. So I could follow those Tanaim. Now, where do we see that this is a machloket Tanaim? We're going to try out one Mishnah here. We're going to say that it's actually not a proof, and then we're going to try yet another source after that. The Tanya, Amar Rabbi Eliezer. This is a Mishnah from Masechet Eduyot. Masechet Eduyot includes testimonies that on that day, the various sages came and gave testimonies of traditions that they heard. And all those traditions, although they're on different subjects, are included within this Masechet Eduyot, which means testimonies. Rabbi Eliezer says, Shamati, I heard a tradition, Keshayu bonin be'echal, asu kelaim la'echal u'klaim la'azarot, ela shebe'echal bonin mibachutz u'ba'azarot bonim mibifnim. I heard that when they were building the second Bet Hamikdash, they made curtains around the sanctuary and curtains, also temporary curtains, around the courtyard area. Because while they were building, they didn't have the walls ready, but they wanted to already start using it and bringing korbanot and lighting the menorah and everything. So they put up temporary curtains so that they could work within the curtains, and then they built the walls. Now the only difference is that around the Hechal itself, the Bet HaMikdash building itself, which is very holy, that the workers would be outside the curtains, and then they be putting the bricks from the outside facing in, so that they're not standing inside the Kodesh itself. That's more respectful. Whereas regarding the temple courtyard, which is less holy, the builders could be there as long as they're tahor. They could be in that area, and they would build, and they would stand on the inside and put the bricks on where the curtain was. And so that's the only difference. But otherwise, they did have curtains because they wanted to separate that area off. Why did they need curtains? Why not just use no curtains? We're going to see in a second. But it seems that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that you need curtains in order to make it sanctified, because otherwise it would not be sanctified, because sanctification was temporary. That would be fit with the opinion of Rav Nachman. אמר רבי יהושע, שמעתי שמקריבין אף על פי שאין בית, אוכלים קודשי קדשים אף על פי שאין כלאים, קודשים קלים מעשה שני אף על פי שאין חומה, מפני שקדושה ראשונה קידשה לשעתה וקידשה לעתיד לבוא. למה מקלה דרבי אליעזר סבר לא קידשה לעתיד לבוא? רבי יהושע says, and this is back to back in the Mishnah and Eduyot, says, I heard a tradition that one can make sacrifices even though there's no Bet HaMikdash. It's good to have a Bet HaMikdash, but let's say you don't have one. Does that mean you can't make a sacrifice? No, you could build a Mizbeach without a Bet HaMikdash. And in fact, in the first Bet HaMikdash, before they had a chance to build the Bet HaMikdash building itself, they already were giving sacrifices just with a Mizbeach. So it's possible to go build a Mizbeach and make sacrifices there. In fact, a few days ago, on Pesach Sheni, there were 9 Jews who smuggled a little goat onto the Temple Mount, and they rushed past security, pushed them down. Eventually, the security there stopped them and arrested them and took the goat away. But they wanted to make a Korban Pesach Sheni on the Temple Mount right now. Last week they wanted to do this, even though there's no Bet HaMikdash. They read this halacha and they tried to do so. In any case, ochlim kodesh kodashim af al pi she'en kelaim, and so one can eat even sacrificial food of holies, like a korban hatat that the kohanim eat, and even though there are no curtains and no walls, certainly even if there's no walls, even no curtains, just out in the open, just in that area that it would be, you can eat it there. And kodashim kalim and maaser sheni, that would be like a korban shelamim, and maaser sheni that can be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. One can do so even though there are no walls of Yerushalayim, as long as you eat it within the area that would be where there would be walls within the borders. So you don't have to have walls, you don't have to have curtains, and you can still do all of the services of the Bet HaMikdash without walls. Why? Why is that permitted? Because the holiness of the original consecration from the first Bet HaMikdash worked for that time and worked for the future also. It's permanent. And therefore, you don't have to put up walls and curtains in order to make it sanctified. It's already sanctified. Now, since Rabbi Yoshua explicitly gave his reasoning, said you don't need curtains because it's already holy. So that would mean that according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says they had to put up curtains first, why did they have to put up curtains? Is it not because the Kedusha of the first Bet HaMikdash is not permanent, so they had to reconsecrate it. In order to consecrate it again, you need to to put curtains up there. You need walls, but in the meantime, you could have curtains, do a consecration ceremony within the curtains, and then you can start using it because they didn't want to wait so long until they built the walls. So we see that, in fact, it is a machloket, and according to the Beit Eliezer, the consecration of the first Beit Hamikdash is temporary. They had to do it again. How do they do it again? They could do it because this would be the same as Rav Nachman's opinion, who says you don't need everything on the list. Even if you just have one of the things on the list, you can make a consecration. And Rabbi Yoshua says, no, the original consecration is permanent. And that would fit with the opinion that you might need everything on the list in order to make a consecration, but that's okay. We don't need a consecration because it's the first one is permanent, and so therefore they didn't even have to bother building walls. So now we see that each of the Amoraim can follow one of these Tanaim. Amar leRavina leRav Ashi, Mimai dilma dekula alma kiddusha rishona kiddusha l'sha'ata v'kiddusha le'atid lavo. And Ravina tells Rav Ashi, that's not the only way to interpret this, the machloket in this Mishnah. It could be that everyone agrees that the first consecration is in fact permanent. Umor mai d'shmiya le'kamar, umor mai d'shmiya le'kamar. And Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, they were just repeating what traditions that they had heard. Then these are independent traditions, and then the author of the Mishnah compiled them and put them back to back to make it look as if they're actually talking to each other. But maybe they're not actually speaking to each other, and Rabbi Yeshua gives his reason as not necessarily in contrast to the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer. These are two independent traditions. And then you'll ask, well, then according to Rabbi Eliezer, why did they have to bother putting curtains? If the original holiness is a permanent holiness, then you don't need to consecrate it again. So therefore, you don't need curtains in order to make consecration. You need curtains or walls, so that you say, here's the border. But if it's already consecrated, then you don't need curtains. So why did they make curtains? Well, it could be they did it just for modesty, and they don't want to have the kohanim working and lighting the menorah and the mizbach haketoret and all the things that they do usually inside the Kodesh, inside the Hechal. You don't want it to be that's just out in the open for everybody to see. There should be a certain amount of seclusion, of modesty. So put up the curtains not because they were legally necessary for consecration, but just for modesty. But in fact, maybe everybody agrees that the holiness was permanent and that you would need everything on the list in order to consecrate something, and they could not consecrate things during the second Beit HaMikdash. So we cannot prove from there that there's a machloket Tanaim about it. Rather, we can see that it is in fact a machloket between two Tanaim, and it's found in the following Baraita de Tanya. This Baraita is commenting on a Mishnah in Masechet Arachin. In Masechet Arachin, it lists 9 cities that were walled since the time of Yehoshua bin Nun. And a walled city has certain laws that apply to it, like if someone sells land in a walled city, he has 1 year to redeem it, otherwise that's it. It goes to the new owner. Unlike land in non-walled cities where the original owner can redeem it, and in Yovel it goes automatically back, so there are laws that apply to such walled cities. De Tanya, Amar Rabbi Ishmael b'Rabbi Yosef, Lama manu chachamim et elu? Rabbi Yosef b'Rabbi Yosef says, how come the Chachamim listed these 9 cities, walled cities from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun in that Mishnah in Arachim? She keshalu b'nei hagola masu elu v'kiddishum avar rishonot batlu mishebatla haaretz. Because when the exiles came back to Eretz Yisrael after the Babylonian exile, they found these cities and they sanctified them. But other places that had been sanctified before, the sanctification was cancelled once they were exiled. What do we learn from this? Alma kasavar kiddusha rishona kiddusha l'sha'ata velo kiddusha le'atid lavo, that the original holiness applied only to that time during the first Beit HaMikdash, but did not continue afterwards. And that's why they had to reconsecrate these cities. We see from here that Rabbi Ishmael ben Rabbi Yosef thinks that the Kedusha is temporary, and other Tanaim think that it's permanent. We already saw that Baraita before. Surely has at least one opinion that says it was permanent. And so Rav Nachman can rely on Rabbi Yoshua ben Rabbi Yoseh. Okay, good. So already we know from here that there is a machloket Tanaim. But once we cite this Baraita, we're going to cite another version of the Baraita that seems to say the opposite in the name of the same sage. Urminhi amar Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yoseh. Same Tana. V'chi elu bilbad hayu. And he has a similar question. Are these the only cities that existed, that were walled cities? Only these that were mentioned in Mishnah Arachin? Halo keva ne'emar shishim ayir kol cheber argo mamlechet Og babashan kol ela arim besurot choma geboha. There's pasuk in Devarim that says there were 60 cities in the area of Argob where Og was on the other side of the Jordan, and they all were fortified with high walls. So these are all fortified from the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Why is this Mishnah saying only 9 cities when there were 60 cities just on one side of the Jordan, and so certainly many, many more cities? So why did the sages list these? Because when the returnees from the Babylonian exile came, they found these cities and they consecrated them. We're going to pause the Baraita for a minute because they're going to see the continuation at the end. But the continuation end is going to show that they did not actually sanctify them because they were already sanctified. So we ask, based on what we're going to about to read, Kiddishum, Hashta ha'amrina lekamanda la siricha lekedushe. What do you mean they sanctified them? The continuation of the Baraita down here says that they did not have to sanctify them because their sanctification was permanent. Ela masuelu umnaum. Rather, it means they found them and they enumerated them. They wanted to count them. Oh, let's give a list of the cities that are holy. Velo elu bilvad. The Baraita continues. Not only these cities. Ela kol sheta'ale biyadcha masor be'avotecha shemukevet chom mimot Yoshua ben Nun kol misvot elu nohagot ba. Not only these 9 cities, but any city that you have a tradition from your forefathers that it had a wall. From the time of Yoshua ben Nun, all the laws of walled cities apply to them. Because the original consecration is permanent and applies for all time. We see from here that Kedusha is permanent. This Baraita contradicts the first Baraita that says that the first Kedusha was temporary. So what does he actually say? 2 answers. Maybe there's 2 traditions in the name of Rabbi Yishmael bar Yoseh. He said something in a lecture, and one student recorded it this way, another student recorded it that way, and it was passed on by the professional memorizers in this version and in that version. And so there's divergent traditions about what he actually said. Or maybe we got the names of one of them wrong. And in fact, one of them is Rabbi Yishmael bar Yoseh, but one of them is Rabbi Elazar bar Yoseh. We got the bar Yoseh right, but we missed the other name. The Tanya Rabbi Elazar ben Yoseh Omer Asher lo choma af al pi she'en lo achshav v'haya lo kodem lachen. The pasuk says any city that has a wall. Now this word lo is a kriyuktiv. It's written lamed aleph that has no wall, but we read it lamed vav that it does have a wall. So reading it's really opposite interpretations. It doesn't have a wall or does have a wall. Rabbi Elazar bar Yoseh combines it and says, even though it does not have a wall now, but it had a wall once upon a time in the past, it retains its holiness. So therefore, the second Baraita that says that Kedusha is permanent, that would be Elazar bar Yoseh. Even if it has no wall, it retains the holiness. And the first Baraita is, as properly named, Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yoseh. In any case, we do see that there is at least one Tannaitic opinion that says that holiness is temporary, and Rav Nachman can rely on that opinion. Next part of the Mishnah teaches, Nitma ba'azara v'ne'alma mimenu tum'a v'chule. If someone entered into the Mikdash area courtyard while tahor, perfectly fine, and then he became tameh there. All of a sudden something happened and he became tameh there. The law is he has to leave as quickly as possible from the nearest exit. If he hangs around, the amount of time it will take to bow down, or he goes to a far farther exit, then if he did it on purpose, he would be chayav karet. And if he did it unknowingly, he have to bring a korban ole veyored. We ask, Tumah ba'azara min elan. What's our source that one would be liable for tum'ah that he contracted while in the azara? Maybe one is only liable if one enters, but when one is tameh beforehand and enters, but maybe if as long as you entered tahor and you became tameh there, even if you walked the long way, maybe there's no punishment. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Katub echad omer et mishkan Adonai timeh, vechatub echad omer ki et mikdash Adonai timeh. Im eno inyan letumah shebachus, tenehu inyan letumah shebifnim. The same paragraph. This is a paragraph in Hukat that talks about the purification process of para aduma. It says don't go in there while you're tameh, because then you are going to bring impurity to Mishkan Hashem. And there's another pasuk a little bit later on that repeats basically the same thing. The first pasuk mentions Mishkan. The second pasuk calls it Mikdash. That'll be relevant in a second. But you have two pasukim. Now why do we need the repetition? So one of them is teaching us that if you were tameh and you entered, then you bring impurity. That's not good. But what do we need the second one? We already have one to say if you were impure before, so the second one must be addressing if one entered while tahor but became tameh inside. That's also the same problem, and one is liable if you leave right away. Okay, what could you do? You did your best, but if you don't leave right away, then one would be liable. So that's the proof. Now we ask about that. Are these pisukim really superfluous? We need both pisukim for a different reason. The Tanya, Rabbi Elazar Omer, Im ne'emar Mishkan, lama ne'emar Mikdash, Im ne'emar Mikdash, lama ne'emar Mishkan. How come one of these pesukim says Mikdash, and one of them says Mishkan, and one of them says Mikdash? Just pick one or the other. Ilu ne'emar Mishkan, velo ne'emar Mikdash, iti omer al Mishkan yehe chayav, sherem asher b'shem ha'mishcha, v'al Mikdash lo yehe chayav. If I only had the pasuk about Mishkan, I would think only the Mishkan, the temporary movable tabernacle that was built in the desert, there one would be liable if one entered while tameh, because that has a greater holiness in that it was sanctified with oil by Moshe. So therefore, that would be a higher level of liability. But the Bet HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, the permanent Bet HaMikdash, which was not consecrated with the oil that Moshe had, maybe this is a lower level, and one would not be liable for entering into it while tameh. Therefore, I need the word Mikdash. V'im ne'emar Mikdash u'lo ne'emar Mishkan. Hayiti omer al Mikdash yeh chayav she'kedushato kedushat olam, v'Mishkan lo yeh chayav. Lekach ne'emar Mishkan, v'lekach ne'emar Mikdash. And if you only had the word Mikdash, I would say only entering into the Mikdash, the Bet HaMikdash, which is permanent, it's a permanent structure, there one is liable if one enters tameh. But regarding the Mishkan, which is a temporary structure, one would not be liable. I might have thought that. That's why I need both words, both the word Mishkan and the word Mikdash. So I already need both of these pesukim, Mishkan, one for Mikdash, to teach us this law. I cannot use it to then also to learn the law that if one was already someone was tahor and became tameh in the Mikdash, one would also be liable. Rabbi Elazar hachikakash yaleh, and we explain no. Rabbi Elazar is wondering about the following in this baraita: Mikedi Mishkan yikre Mikdash, Mikdash yikre Mishkan. Nichtobo idi v'idi Mikdash o idi v'idi Mishkan. Mishkan Mikdash lamali shema minat tarte. Rabbi Elazar was actually, his question was as follows: since Mishkan and Mikdash, those words are interchangeable, because the Mishkan, the temporary tabernacle in the desert, is sometimes called Mikdash, and the Bet HaMikdash is sometimes called a Mishkan. So therefore, you can write both of them Mikdash or both of them Mishkan. Why do I need to have one time it has Mishkan and one time Mikdash? And he's answering that question. But there's a even more fundamental question here of why are there two Pisukim at all? So it was really double markers. One, why are there two Pesukim? And so from the fact that there are two Pesukim, we learn that one is liable if one enters tameh, and one is also liable if one becomes tameh. Okay, so that I learned from the fact that there are two Pesukim. But if that's all it was going to teach, it could have said Mishkan and Mishkan in both places, and Mishkan here, and then it could have said Mishkan here also, and I would have learned that. So I learned this law from the fact that there are two Pesukim. But then I can learn an additional law because it could have said the same word in both places. Why is it changed? And one time say Mishkan, one time Hamikdash? That's what Rabbi Elazar is teaching here, that the interchanging words, the fact that he uses one here and then one there, can teach us that it applies to both the Mishkan and the Mikdash. And so we see, Shema Minat Tarte, we can learn both of these laws from all of these differences, the doubling and the variation in the word. We can learn both sets of laws. Now we do see that the Bet HaMikdash is called a Mishkan because it says in Vayikra, which is talking about the blessings and curses, and it says, I will put my Mishkan within you. And this is talking about after they get into the land of Israel, my Mishkan will be there. Since it's in the land of Israel, so referring to the Bet HaMikdash. Assuming that once you're in Israel, you're sure you're going to have a Bet HaMikdash and not just a traveling Mishkan, which might be the Peshat. But here, since it's talking about the land, and we're assuming that's the Beit HaMikdash, so you see that Mishkan refers to the Mikdash. Ela Mishkan ikre Mikdash min the land. But where do we see that the tabernacle of the desert is called a Mikdash? Maybe from the fact that it says the Kehatim, the family of the Leviim, are going to carry the Mikdash. And so they're not carrying a Beit HaMikdash, they're carrying the Mishkan, right? But that's not a good proof because Hahu Ba'aron Ketiv, the Kehatim are actually only carrying the Aron. And the Aron is called the Mikdash. It's very, very holy. So that itself is called the Mikdash. But that doesn't prove that the whole Mishkan, all the curtains, the whole thing, is the whole tent is called a Mikdash. Ela mehacha ve'asul leMikdash ve'shachanti betocham. Uchti bekeochel asher ani marei otecha et tavnit haMishkan. But rather, it's in the instructions for building the Mishkan. Hashem says, make me a Mikdash. And it refers the next pasuk, everything that I showed you regarding the pattern or the structure of the Mishkan. So since it's talking about the instructions of how to build the Mishkan, and yet Hashem says, build me a Mikdash. So we see that the Mishkan is in fact called Mikdash. The Mishnah continues and says, if someone enters into the Mikdash area while tahor and becomes tameh, and then either he bows down or he waits the amount of time that it would take to bow down. So either way, he would be liable for staying there too long. And so the bowing down part means even if he did it quickly, he bowed down quicker than it would take most people, but he actually did the act, he's liable. Or if he didn't actually bow, but waited there the usual time it would take people to bow down, one is also liable. Amar Rava, lo shanu ela shishtachava kelape penim, ava ishtachava kelape chutz, shaha'in, lo shaha lo. Rava says, when it says if he actually bowed down, that means only if he actually bowed towards the inside, towards the Kodesh Kodashim. Then that's officially called an act of worship because he's facing the proper way. Then, if he did it even quickly, he would be liable. But if he bowed the wrong way, he bowed away from the Kodesh Kodashim, that's not called bowing. That's the same as just standing there. So, if he bowed or stood, bowed the wrong way or stood, then it would have to be a certain amount of time, then he would be liable. But shorter than that, he would not be liable. But if he bowed towards Kodesh Kodashim, even if it took shorter than the usual time, he would be liable. That's one version of what Rava said. But the other version has Rava saying the same thing, but not on this part of the Mishnah, but rather on the sefa of the Mishnah. That said, meaning not on the word hishtachava, but rather on the continuation. On this part of it that says if he waited the amount of time it would take to bow. Which means that bowing itself requires requires a certain amount of time. Regarding that inference, that's what Rava was talking about. Amar Rava, Lo shanu ela ishtachava kelape chutz. When it says that bowing takes a certain amount of time, that's if one is bowing away from the Kodesh Kodashim. It's not considered anything unless it lasts a certain given amount of time. Aval kelape penim afagav de lo shaha. But if he bows towards the Kodesh Kodashim, then even if he didn't wait that amount of, we're going to define that amount of time in a minute. Then even if he did it quickly, he is liable. There's no practical difference between the first version of Rava and the second version of Rava. It's just that what was he saying his statement on the word ishtachava, or was he saying his statement on sheshah kedei ishtachava? You end up in the same place, but it's just different ways of interpreting the wording of the Mishnah. V'achika amar ishtachava kelape penim o sheshah kedei ishtachava behach ishtachava kelape chutz chayav. And the Mishnah means as follows: if one bowed towards the inside, no matter how short he did it, even if he did it in half a second, he jumped down and jumped up quickly, he would be liable. Or if he faced outside or just waited the amount of time that it would take to normally bow, then he is also liable one way or another. Now, what is the definition of bowing where that is called tarrying, and bowing that is not tarrying? And so it's not about actually jumping down and jumping up, moving quickly, but rather it's actually a different type of bow. There are a couple of different types of bows. One of them is kiri'ah. That's just kneeling. Here's a picture of the Kohen Gadol making vidui, and that's when he would say Hashem's name. And so this guy here, he's simply kneeling. That is quick. You just go down on the knees and come back up. But shehiyah, one that takes a long time, is spreading out arms and legs. That's the guy like this person here. He spread out his arms and legs, so that takes longer to do. And that's what it means. So if one is doing it towards Kodesh Kodashim, then even kneeling, which is a short one, takes a short time, that would be liable. If he became Tameh and then he kneeled, he's already prohibited. But if he's facing outside, away from the Beit Hamikdash, and he just kneeled, then that's not, he would not be liable. Only if he prostrated or waited the amount of time it would take to prostrate with his face on the floor, then he would be liable. How long is that? If you're not actually doing it, so how long is that time period? Okay, so there's three different versions about who actually said this. There is a machloket about it. So one version says Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani and the other person who was with him, and the other person with him was Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. Another version has Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi as being the main person, and the other person with him, was this first guy, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmani. But others say it was actually Rabbi Shimon bar Nachmani. Anyway, one of them, Chad amar ke memre dehai pesuka, v'chad amar ke mi vayichreu lesefa. וכל בני ישראל רואים ברדת האש וכבוד אדוני על הבית ויכרו אפיים ארצה על הרצפה וישתחוו והודות אדוני כי טוב כי לעולם חסדו. One of the opinions says, as long as it would take to say this entire pasuk from Divrei Yamim Bet, this is describing the Beit Hamikdash built by King Shlomo when he consecrated it, and the fire came down from heaven, and everybody saw the honor of Hashem in the fire, and they bowed down, prostrated themselves, and sang and said, "Give thanks to Hashem because He is good. His love endures forever." How much time would that take to say? Okay, you could time it as we just said it. So one opinion says the amount of time it would take to say this entire pasuk. The other opinion says, no, half the pasuk. From the word vayichreu until the end. That's the main part of it. The rest of it is just describing the scene, but what they actually did is this part, and so it's the amount of time that takes to describe the pasuk that describes them kneeling and prostrating and saying this praise. That's the amount of time that would take to be liable, even if you're just standing there. And you wait that long. If you did it on purpose, then that would be liable to karet. If by mistake, then a korban. Tenor banan kida al apayim v'chen omar vatikot bat sheva apayim eretz. Now we're going to see there's actually three different ways of bowing. One is called kida. Kida is falling on one's face. That would be more like if you see one of these guys in the back, they might be sitting on their knees and then they put their face all the way down to the ground, which is probably what most people do nowadays on Yom Kippur. And so that's called kida. And because it says regarding Bathsheba that vatikod, she put her, and it says apayim, face, aretz, on the ground. So she put her face on the ground, and it says tikod. So that means face on the ground. Kiri'ah al birkav mechen omer mikeroa al birkav. And kiri'ah, that means kneeling on one's knees. As it says regarding King Shlomo, he went before the altar of Hashem, and from kneeling upon his knees. So kiroa al birkav, so it says the word kiri'ah, and it says knees. Hishtachavah, that's totally flat on the ground, outstretched arms and legs. You see, if this guy here is not outstretched, his legs are folded under him and his arms are not totally outstretched. So to be totally outstretched, then you have to be completely prostrated on the ground. That's hishtachavah. V'chen omer, this is what Yaakov says regarding Yosef's dreams. Are we going to come, me and your mother and your brothers, to prostrate down on the ground? So you see, this is totally on the ground, unlike Kida, which is only face on the ground. This is totally prostrated on the ground. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.